Sorry, this table's full for good kids only, my sister said, holding her arm out to stop my son. I still hear her voice sometimes, sharp and light at the same time, like it was all a joke, like she hadn't just carved something permanent into my son's heart, when she stretched her arm out across the empty chair and said, Sorry, this table's full for good kids only. And for a second I genuinely thought I'd misheard her, because who says that to a child? Who says that in front of everyone? Who says that to my child? But then I saw Evan freeze beside me, his small hand tightening around mine, his shoulders shrinking in that way I had seen too many times before. And then I saw Courtney's kids giggling, actually giggling, like this was some kind of game, like humiliation was entertainment. And suddenly every memory I had tried to excuse, every moment I had brushed aside to keep the peace, came crashing back all at once, because this wasn't new, not really. It had just never been this blatant, this public, this cruel. It started years ago, small comments disguised as jokes, things like, oh, Evan's just different, isn't he? Or he's a bit sensitive, always said with that same tilted smile, always followed by laughter that made it sound harmless unless you really listened, unless you saw the way Evan would go quiet afterward, the way he'd cling to me a little tighter, the way he'd ask me later in the car, Mom, did I do something wrong? And every time I would tell him, no, of course not, you're perfect, you're kind, you're more than enough. But deep down I knew something was off. I knew Courtney wasn't just teasing, she was marking him, singling him out in a way that her own children never were, and I told myself it was just her personality, that she was blunt, that she didn't think before she spoke, that she didn't mean harm, because that was easier than admitting my own sister was slowly becoming my child's first bully. That day at the restaurant was supposed to be simple, just a family lunch, nothing special. My parents were there, a couple of cousins, the usual noise and chatter, plates clinking, waiters weaving through the tables, and Evan had been excited, actually excited, because he had gotten dressed on his own and picked out his favorite shirt, the one with the tiny blue boats on it, and he kept asking if everyone would be there, if Aunt Courtney would be nice today, and I remember hesitating just for a second before saying, of course, because what else was I supposed to say? How do you prepare a child for being excluded by family? How do you tell them the people who are supposed to love them might not choose them? So I didn't. I just smiled and hoped for the best like I always did. And for a while it seemed fine. We arrived. Everyone greeted us. My mom hugged Evan tightly, my dad ruffled his hair, and even Courtney gave one of her usual air kisses and said, hey, in that detached way of hers, and I thought maybe, just maybe, today would be different. Maybe I had been overthinking everything, maybe she had grown out of whatever this was, but then we sat down, and the table was already mostly full, her kids spread out across the seats, bags and jackets occupying empty chairs like they owned the space, and Evan looked at the one open seat beside them, the only place left, and he started to move toward it, still holding my hand. Still, and that's when she did it. That's when her arm came out, smooth and deliberate, blocking the chair like a barrier, and she said it, sorry, this table's full for good kids only, with a small laugh, like it was clever, like it was harmless, and everything inside me went silent for a second, like the world had paused just to let that moment sink in, and I looked at Evan and saw the confusion first, then the hurt, then that awful familiar attempt to pretend it didn't matter, and that was the moment something in me shifted, something final, because I realized this wasn't just about rudeness anymore. This was about my son learning where he stood in his own family, and I refused, absolutely refused, to let that lesson take root. So instead of arguing, instead of giving Courtney the reaction she probably expected, I did something she didn't see coming. I knelt down calmly, zipped up Evan's jacket with steady hands, even though my chest felt like it was caving in, and I said softly, come on, we're leaving. And he looked up at me, surprised, maybe even a little relieved, and he didn't ask questions, he just nodded. Because kids understand more than we think, and we walked out together without another word, past the table, past the laughter that had already started to die down awkwardly, past my parents' confused expressions. And I didn't look back, not once, because if I had, I might have exploded, and I needed to be calm. I needed to show Evan that we didn't stay where we weren't respected, that we didn't beg for a seat at a table that didn't want us, and the entire drive home he was quiet, staring out the window. And I could feel the questions building inside him. But he didn't ask them right away, and when we finally parked, he turned to me and said, Mom, am I not a good kid? And that, more than anything, was the moment that sealed everything. Because no child should ever have to ask that, not because of something a grown adult said for amusement, and I reached over and held his face gently and told him, you are the best kid I know, and I meant it with everything I had. But I also knew words weren't enough anymore, that reassurance alone wouldn't fix what had been allowed to happen over and over again, and as I sat there in the car, holding my son while he tried not to cry, I realized something I had avoided for years. Silence had made me complicit. Every time I brushed it off, every time I chose peace over confrontation, I had given Courtney permission to continue, and now it had escalated to this, to outright exclusion, to public humiliation, to my child questioning his worth, and that was where it ended. That was the line, and as we went inside, as Evan slowly started to relax again, pulling out his toys and trying to act normal. I made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary, because this wasn't just about protecting him in the moment. It was about changing the entire dynamic, about showing him that love isn't conditional, that family isn't allowed to treat you like less, and that sometimes walking away isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing you can do. And I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for certain. Courtney was not going to get away with this. Not this time, not ever again. Sleep that night. Not even for a minute. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Evan's face again in that restaurant, that quiet confusion turning into something heavier, something I knew no child should carry. And the more I replayed it, the clearer everything became. Like a fog lifting that I hadn't even realized I was living in for years. Because the truth was, Courtney had always been like this. Just subtle enough that I could excuse it. Just indirect enough that I could tell myself I was overreacting. But now there was no ambiguity left, no gray area to hide behind. She had said it plainly, out loud, in front of everyone. And my silence in that moment, walking away without confrontation, wasn't weakness like I first feared. It was restraint, because if I had stayed, if I had spoken right then, I would have said things that couldn't be taken back. And maybe part of me still wanted to believe there was a smarter way to handle it, a way that would protect Evan without dragging him through more drama. But as the hours passed and the sun started to rise, that hesitation hardened into something else entirely, clarity, and with it came a decision that felt both ruthless and completely justified, because 2 weeks from that day, we were all supposed to leave for the Florida Keys, a trip I had planned for months. A luxury vacation I had carefully budgeted and paid for in full. Not just for me and Evan, but for the entire family, including Courtney and her kids, separate suites, excursions, dinners, everything arranged down to the smallest detail, and I remembered how excited everyone had been when I first told them. How Courtney had immediately started talking about beach photos and spa days like it was already hers, like she was entitled to it, and I had let it slide, because that's what I always did. I gave, I accommodated, I smoothed things over, but now, sitting alone in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, and that memory still burning in my chest, I realized something that felt almost shocking in its simplicity. I didn't owe her that trip. I didn't owe her comfort. I didn't owe her access to my time, my money, or my son, not after what she had done, not after years of smaller cuts that had finally turned into something undeniable. And once that thought settled in, everything else fell into place with a kind of calm precision that surprised even me, because I wasn't acting out of anger anymore. I was acting out of certainty, and that made all the difference. So I opened my email, pulled up the booking confirmation, and stared at it for a long moment, my finger hovering over the options, and for just a second, doubt tried to creep in, that old familiar voice telling me I was being too harsh, that this would cause drama, that the family would be upset, that maybe I should talk to her first, give her a chance to apologize. But then I remembered Evan's question. Am I not a good kid? And the doubt vanished completely, because no apology would erase that moment, no excuse would justify it. And more importantly, no future trip would be worth exposing him to more of the same. So I clicked Modify Reservation, removed Courtney's suite, canceled every activity that included her children, adjusted the bookings to a simple 2-person itinerary, just me and Evan, and confirmed the changes without hesitating again. And when the confirmation email came through, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief, not guilt, not anxiety, just a quiet, steady relief, like I had finally done something right. Something that aligned with what I should have been doing all along. And for the first time since the restaurant, I felt like I could breathe again, like I had taken back control of something that had been slipping away for years, and the rest of that day passed almost peacefully. Evan went to school, came home, talked about a science project he was excited about, and I listened, really listened, because I was starting to understand how important those small moments were, how easily they could be overshadowed by the kind of negativity I had allowed into our lives, and by the time evening came, I had almost forgotten about the inevitable fallout. Almost, because at exactly 7:42 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message that I knew was coming, even before I looked at the screen, and sure enough, it was Courtney, casual as ever, like nothing had happened, like the restaurant incident had been erased from her memory the second it was over, and her text read, "Hey, what time is check-in for the Keys?" Trying to plan outfits, LOL, and I stared at it for a moment, feeling that familiar flicker of disbelief at how effortlessly she moved through life without accountability, how easily she expected everything to just continue as normal, and in the past, I would have taken a deep breath, crafted a polite response, maybe even ignored what had happened altogether just to keep things smooth, but not this time, because this time, I wasn't interested in maintaining an illusion of peace. This time, I was interested in setting a boundary so clear it couldn't be ignored or misunderstood. So instead of overthinking it, instead of softening my words, I typed exactly what needed to be said. Nothing more, nothing less. Sorry, this table's full for good kids only, and I hit send before I could second guess myself, and for a moment, there was silence. The kind that feels almost electric, like the calm before something breaks. And then my phone lit up again, her response, coming through faster than I expected. What? What is that supposed to mean? Followed by another message almost immediately. Is this a joke? And I could practically hear the irritation creeping into her tone, the confusion turning into defensiveness, because for once, she wasn't in control of the narrative. For once, she was the one being shut out, and I didn't rush to respond. I let her sit in that uncertainty for a few minutes before replying simply, "Your reservations have been cancelled. It's just me and Evan going," and that was when everything exploded, message after message flooding in, accusations, insults, attempts to twist the situation into something else entirely. "You're seriously overreacting. It was a joke. Oh my God, you're punishing my kids now? That's disgusting." And I read them all without responding right away, not because I didn't have answers, but because I realized something important in that moment. She wasn't looking for a conversation, she was looking for control. And when she couldn't get it, she defaulted to anger, to manipulation, to whatever would put her back in a position of power. And I wasn't going to give her that. So when I finally did respond, it was calm, direct, and final. "No child of mine will be treated the way you treated Evan. Not at a table, not on a trip, not anywhere. This isn't a punishment, it's a boundary," and I left it at that, because there was nothing more to explain, nothing more to justify, and for a while there was silence again, longer this time, and I almost thought that be the end of it, that maybe she would process it, privately, maybe even reflect on what had happened. But I should have known better, because Courtney didn't do quiet reflection, she did public performance, and it started the next morning, when I opened my phone to a flood of notifications, messages from relatives, missed calls, and tagged posts on social media, and my stomach dropped as I clicked on the first one, because there it was. A long dramatic post from her, painting herself as the victim, talking about how she had been cut off from a family vacation without warning, how her children were heartbroken, how she didn't understand what she had done to deserve such cruelty, and I read it once, then twice, feeling that initial surge of anger rise up before something else replaced it, something steadier, almost detached. Because for the first time, I wasn't scrambling to defend myself. I wasn't panicking about what people would think, because I knew the truth, and more importantly, I knew I had acted in a way that protected my child, and that mattered more than any narrative she could spin, and sure enough, it didn't take long for cracks to start appearing in her story. Because people who had been there at the restaurant began to comment, quietly at first, then more openly, correcting her version of events, mentioning what she had said, how she had said it, how Evan had reacted, and then something I hadn't expected happened. Even her own stepchildren, teenagers who had seen her behavior up close for years, started chiming in, not directly attacking her, but sharing small, pointed observations that made it clear this wasn't an isolated incident, that this was a pattern, and as the comments grew, the tone of the conversation shifted, sympathy turning into skepticism, then into something closer to accountability, and I watched it all unfold without adding a single word, because I didn't need to. The truth was speaking for itself in a way I never could have orchestrated. And for the first time, in a long time, I felt something that surprised me again, not just relief, but a kind of quiet justice, not loud or dramatic, but steady and undeniable, like the balance had finally started to correct itself. And later that evening, as I sat with Evan helping him with his homework, listening to him talk about ocean animals and coral reefs with a kind of excitement I hadn't seen in a while, I realized that everything that had happened, the restaurant, the cancellation, the confrontation, even the fallout, had led to this moment, this simple, peaceful moment where he felt safe, where he felt valued, where he could just be a kid without worrying about whether he was good enough to sit at someone's table, and that, more than anything, told me I had made the right choice, no matter how messy the consequences might still become, because some things are worth the chaos, and protecting your child is at the top of that list, always. The strangest part of everything that happened after the fallout wasn't the silence from Courtney, though that in itself felt unnatural-like, the calm after a storm that had been raging for years. It was the way the rest of the family slowly, almost cautiously began to shift, like people waking up from something they hadn't realized they were part of, and I didn't trust it at first. If I'm being honest, because I had spent too long being the one who adjusted, who explained things away, who absorbed the discomfort so everyone else could pretend things were fine. So when my mom called me 2 days after the social media chaos, her voice quieter than usual, asking if she could come over and talk, my first instinct was to brace myself for more of the same. More let's not make this bigger than it is, more that's just how Courtney is, more pressure to smooth things over for the sake of family harmony. But when she arrived and sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she barely touched, I saw something different in her expression, something I hadn't seen before. Regret, real and unmistakable, and she didn't waste time easing it, didn't dress it up, in soft language the way she usually did, she just said it plainly. I should have said something that day, and for a moment I didn't respond, because I wanted to make sure I had heard her correctly, because those words mattered more than she probably realized, and when I stayed quiet she continued, her voice unsteady now. I saw Evan's face, and I froze, and that's not an excuse, I didn't think she would go that far, not in front of everyone, not to a child, and I felt something shift inside me as she spoke. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but an opening, a crack in the wall I had started building to protect myself and Evan, because this was the first time anyone had acknowledged it without minimizing it, without trying to soften the impact, and before I could say anything, my dad, who had been unusually silent throughout all of this, cleared his throat from where he stood by the doorway, like he had been rehearsing his words and still wasn't sure how to say them, and then, he stepped forward and said, "This stops now," in a tone I hadn't heard from him since I was a child, firm and final, and when he saw the surprise on my face, he added, "Family doesn't get to treat each other like that, and if they do, there are consequences." And it hit me then that this wasn't just an apology, this was a shift in the foundation itself, because for years, the unspoken rule in our family had been to tolerate, to endure, to avoid conflict at all costs, and now, suddenly, that rule was being challenged, and not by me alone, but by the people who had once enforced it through their silence, and we sat there for a long time after that, talking through everything, not just the restaurant incident, but all the smaller moments that had led up to it. The comments, the patterns, the way Evan had been singled out, and the more we talked, the clearer it became that this hadn't gone unnoticed. It had just gone unaddressed, tucked away under layers of excuses and discomfort, and by the end of that conversation, something had been decided, not in a dramatic declared way, but in a quiet collective understanding. Things were going to change, and that change became real a week later, when my parents hosted another family gathering. Smaller this time, more intentional, and before anyone arrived, my dad sent out a message to everyone, simple and direct, laying out expectations that had never needed to be said before but clearly did now. No insults, no sarcasm aimed at children, no jokes that came at someone else's expense, and most importantly, a clear consequence. Anyone who couldn't respect those boundaries would not be welcome at future gatherings. And when I read that message, I felt something I hadn't expected. Validation, not loud or overwhelming, but steady and grounding, like the weight I had been carrying wasn't mine alone anymore. And when the day of the gathering came, I hesitated for a moment before deciding to go. Not for the sake of tradition, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to see what this new version of our family might look like, and more importantly, I wanted Evan to see it too, to see that things could be different, that people could change, that boundaries could be respected. And when we arrived, the atmosphere was noticeably different, quieter in a way that felt intentional rather than tense. Conversations softer, more mindful, and Courtney wasn't there, which wasn't surprising, but what mattered more was that no one tried to excuse her absence. No one made jokes to fill the gap. No one pretended everything was normal. Instead, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of why things were the way they were, and for the first time, it felt like honesty had replaced avoidance. And Evan noticed it too. I could tell by the way he moved more freely, the way he laughed without looking over his shoulder, the way he sat down at the table without hesitation, without asking if it was okay, and I watched him carefully, not out of worry this time, but out of something closer to hope, because this was what I had wanted for him all along. A space. He didn't have to question his place, where he didn't have to earn his seat through some invisible standard of goodness. And later that evening, as we drove home, he turned to me with a small, thoughtful smile and said, "Today felt nice," and I smiled back, my chest tightening in the best possible way, because nice was such a simple word, but coming from him, after everything, it meant more than anything else. And the following week we finally left for the trip. Just the two of us, just as I had planned after everything changed, and from the moment we arrived, I could see the difference in him. The way the tension he had been carrying seemed to lift with each passing day. The way he explored everything with genuine curiosity instead of cautious hesitation. And one afternoon, as we stood by the water watching a group of fish move in perfect, shimmering patterns beneath the surface, he started asking questions. Real questions, detailed ones about how they lived, how they moved, how entire ecosystems worked together, and I listened, answering what I could, looking up the rest, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation he said, almost casually, "I think I want to learn more about this, like, a lot more." And I glanced at him, really looked at him, and saw something new there, something that hadn't been there before, not just interest, but confidence, a sense of possibility that hadn't been overshadowed by doubt. And it hit me then that this was what happens when a child feels safe, when they're not busy protecting themselves from subtle cruelty, when they're not trying to figure out if they belong. They grow, they explore, they become more of who they're meant to be. And the rest of the trip unfolded like that, quiet, meaningful moments layered over each other, building something stronger than anything we had left behind. And when we returned home, life didn't magically become perfect. There were still conversations to navigate, still boundaries to maintain, still the lingering reality that not everyone would agree with the choices I had made, but that didn't matter as much as it used to, because I had already made the most important decision, the one that set everything else in motion. I chose my son. I chose his well-being over comfort, over tradition, over the illusion of a peaceful family that only existed because someone was willing to be hurt in silence, and I wasn't willing to be that person anymore. Not for Courtney, not for anyone. And in the weeks that followed, I made that choice clear in ways that couldn't be ignored. I sent a message to the extended family, not emotional or accusatory, just direct and honest, explaining that I would no longer attend any gatherings where disrespect toward my child was tolerated. That this wasn't about holding grudges, it was about creating a space where Evan felt safe and valued, and the response was mixed, as I expected. Some understood immediately, some needed time, some disagreed quietly, but none of that changed my position, because boundaries aren't about convincing others, they're about defining what you will and won't accept, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely certain of mine, and as time passed, something unexpected happened again. Not dramatic, not sudden, but steady and real. Peace. The kind that doesn't come from everything being perfect, but from knowing you're no longer compromising the things that matter most. And sometimes, when I think back to that moment in the restaurant, to those words that once felt so sharp and humiliating, I realize they marked the end of something, not just a painful chapter, but a pattern I had allowed for far too long, because in trying to keep everyone at the table, I had forgotten to ask whether it was a table worth sitting at in the first place. And now, I don't wonder anymore, because I've built something better, something quieter but infinitely stronger. A life where my son doesn't have to prove he's a good kid to deserve a place, where he knows, without question, that he already belongs, and that is something no one gets to take away from him ever again.